Welcome to the Berkeley Center, nearby the campus of Georgetown University. I'm Tom Farr. I'm a senior fellow here at the Berkeley Center and also the director of the Religious Freedom Project, which is one of the programs here at the center and the one that is sponsoring our very special guest today. A hearty welcome to all of you. I see a number of old friends, and I see a number of people that may be new here, and I do hope you'll take an opportunity to introduce yourself to me and let me get to know you a bit later in the afternoon or as we move forward here. If I might, I'll just tell you very briefly about the Religious Freedom Project. This is we're nearing the end of our third year and about to begin our those of us who are Trinitarians like to put things in threes. We're about to begin our third year, a 3-year approach in January. Those of you who are not signed up for our newsletters and events, announcements, please do so while you're here. There are 3 premises that motivate our project. The first is that religious freedom is important. At one time, I used to think that was an uncontroversial statement. I found that it sometimes in some venues is quite controversial, but we think it's important to individuals, whether they're religious or not, and to whole societies, in fact, all societies elsewhere. The second premise is that religious freedom is in crisis around the world. And the crisis varies in its intensity and nature, but whereas we have violent persecution outside the West, inside the West we have, in our view, a decline of religious freedom that gives us reason for concern. And our third premise is that the people who shape opinions aren't paying enough attention to the crisis, namely the academy, the secular media. Is that me? I will cease talking until we solve that problem. Unless it's someone's cell phone. Okay. And our third premise is that people who in the academy, the secular media, and most importantly of all, the policy world, governments, don't understand, don't appreciate the nature and the importance of the crisis in religious liberty. So those are our 3 premises. They're all, to one extent or another, I suppose, debatable, and that's what we do at the Religious Freedom Project. We debate them. And so for the past 3 years, we have brought to Georgetown and other venues around the world people with differing points of view to talk about the importance of religious freedom. What does it mean? Why is it important? What is its value to individuals and societies? What are the arguments of the skeptics? And we entertain all voices. I love to think of the great definition of religious freedom, among many great things, said by the Jesuit John Courtney Murray. He called religious freedom creeds intelligibly in conflict. And so we've adopted that sort of as an informal definition for the Religious Freedom Project. So please join with us if you haven't already. Come to our events, talk to us, give us your views. That's what we're about. Now, I'm going to introduce our guests in just a moment, but I want to set the stage a little bit for our discussion today. It strikes me that we have 3 cross-cutting, at least 3 cross-cutting themes that will come out in the discussion that we're going to hear from our guests today. The first, of course, and the most important, is what has Christianity contributed to the history of the sceptered isle? The great history of Great Britain and indeed the United Kingdom, going back centuries, has had so much to do with the way the world has developed, and certainly our own country. And here we have with the center at Stonyhurst, the Christian Heritage Center, an attempt to bring together in documentary form investments and relics and in various kinds of artifacts of marvelous, some of which you have seen here, particular preciousness to those of us who are Roman Catholics, but of, I think, interest to anyone of goodwill who understands the value that Christianity has had to the United Kingdom and to Great Britain. So the first thing is to talk about the importance of this center and this issue to Great Britain, and amid what I think, again, one of those controversial statements, but I think I could prove it if challenged, that religious freedom is in decline in the Sceptred Isle. It is experiencing challenges throughout the West, including in Great Britain, and I think that this is particularly timely. The second theme is the Jesuit theme, the importance of the Jesuit contribution both in Britain and in the United States. Jesuits, of course, were integral to the survival of Catholicism in Britain after the Counter-Reformation, or after the Reformation and during the Counter-Reformation. Many of the 40 martyrs that were canonized by Pope Paul VI, I believe, in 1970, were Jesuits, and we'll hear something about some of these. And, of course, Jesuits played a vital role in our own founding and in the founding of this great university, Georgetown itself, founded by John Carroll, who became the first Catholic bishop in the United States, and his cousin, Charles Carroll, both of whom I gather used this school book. It looks well worn. I see that they must have marked in the margins just like I do, so that makes me feel very good. Charles Carroll, the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence. So Jesuits, the Jesuit theme is so important to this university and indeed to the Religious Freedom Project. And finally, the question of Christian persecution around the world and the violent persecution of those in places like Syria and Egypt and to a certain extent in China and elsewhere around the world today. The pungency, if I can put it that way, of talking about some of these great martyrs of Christian history in the context of the 21st century. I guess it was 1534 that St. Thomas More was it 36? It was 35. Okay. I'm trained as an American diplomat, so I come on both sides of something. 1535, long time ago, and yet here we are in the 21st century with all of our wonderful progress and wonderful things, and we're still engaged in a problem of persecution, of course, not only of Christians, but there's plenty of evidence to suggest that Christians are particularly in the crosshairs of this insidious and outrageous assault on human dignity around the world. So with that, let me give a very brief introduction to our guests. You have a rather full biography of each of them, and I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will speak to us. Again, let me just say, as a collective to all of you, what a delight it is to have you. We had a little chance to get to know each other. I've not met any of the three until today, and to get to know them is indeed an honor. And in the order that they're going to speak, I have to tell you, I told the three of them, in the Middle Ages, I was once a historian of Britain. That is to say, many decades ago, I went to graduate school and studied British history and studied Tudor and Stuart history. And to read their biographies is just to dip yourself into the history of this wonderful country. And not least, our first speaker, Lord Nicholas Windsor, who is, as you can see in the bio, he's a grandson of King George V and a cousin of the current Queen Elizabeth. In 2000, he converted to Roman Catholicism and received into full communion the following year, 2001. Now, this really is fascinating not only for itself, but the question of, okay, how many males in the British royal line have converted to Catholicism since the Reformation? The answer is not many. We, as his bio says, probably Charles II on his deathbed, Charles II who was restored to the crown after the English Revolution in the 17th century, died 1685, and I firmly believe that he converted on his deathbed. But we'll say probably for the moment because that's what's in the bio. But prior to that, who was the last British male member of the royal family who was a Catholic? Converted, do you think James II? Yes, of course he was. Of course he was. How about before James II? That's what I should have said. Of course, James II was Catholic. Probably Henry VIII, right? You have to go back to Henry VIII. Well, in any case, Lord Windsor, we are delighted to have you with us today. He will be speaking first, and please read his full bio. You have it with you. Second will be Jan Graphius, whom you've already heard from just a few minutes ago, who is the curator of collections at Stonyhurst College. She's a Scot. She studied art history at St. Andrews, currently studying for her PhD at Aberdeen University on the subject of the relics at St. Omer's, which is the continental predecessor to Stonyhurst, which I believe you will be speaking about in just a moment. And then last but not least, a man that I have to tell you I just met today, but he's been a hero of mine for about 20 years. Lord David Alton of Liverpool has, again, you can read of his many accomplishments, but what I would like to focus on is that, and why he's a personal hero of mine, is that he has been for decades doing what I've just been doing for a few years, and that is trying to fight for religious freedom. He has fought for many causes, including for the cause of the life and the protection of the unborn. He has fought for human rights across the board, from conception to the end of life. He has been to North Korea, exposed himself to some danger in what is arguably the worst place on earth for all forms of human rights abuse, including religious persecution. He's a brave man who has served as a member of parliament, an MP. Americans always have to be tutored in the distinctions, but we all have two houses. Of course, the British, the House of Commons, where he served, I believe, for 17 years, and then at the beginning of the century became a life peer and serves in the House of Lords, where he continues the fight not only for religious freedom, but for the sanctity of life and the dignity of all of us. So if I might ask for, if you would, an applause to welcome all of our guests, and then we'll begin with Lord Nicholas.
Well, I start by thanking Ambassador Farr for his very kind words. And thank you for having us here to speak at the Berkeley Center. It's a great honor for us. Now, I don't have to ask the question rhetorically that I did at the last meeting we had, which is, why do we come here to talk about a Jesuit school? It's home from home, in a sense. The founder of your university, as Mr. Farr said, was John Carroll, a alumnus of our school, then in France, or was it Liège by then? In France he studied. A school in the north of Lancashire in England, but much more than a school, a repository of memory for the Catholic community in England and more widely. When I was received into the church, I was particularly conscious of the fact that I lived in a country that had largely forgotten its Catholic past, not least because of one of the most thoroughgoing efforts by the state, a state in history, to extirpate a culture, which was the culture of the British Isles from the arrival of Augustine of Canterbury in the 5th century up until the 16th century, and the dissolution of the monasteries and the continuing program of the state from there on to ensure that the Catholic Church would never revive and never become the dominant culture in England again. Now, there were, of course, Catholics who were determined not to let this suppression of culture take place. And we owe in England, as again Mr. Farr adverted to, we owe a great debt to the Jesuits, to the first generations or the second generation of Jesuits who decided that they would ensure the education of English children, English boys in any case, in those times by setting up a school in France when it was impossible to teach the Catholic faith in England. In fact, it was difficult enough for those boys even to attend a school in France. They had to go in disguise, avoid English agents at the ports in France. But they went, and a great many of them became priests, and returned to England with a rather low chance of surviving the enterprise, and they were butchered by the state, at the hands of the state, in the late 16th and early 17th centuries in particular. So these brave young men and enterprising Jesuits not only kept alive the flame of the culture, but in their work, in what they did, but also in terms of the extraordinary artifacts that were preserved in this school. The parents, not just the parents of the boys who went to St. Omer's in France, saw the Jesuit community there as a depository for items, the few items that survived the Reformation. And it became a safe haven for these items reflecting the sacred history of England. And it's those items, that collection, that we propose to use in a way that we hope will contribute to the building up again of a Catholic culture, a Christian culture in England, and more widely. The Jesuits, as you know, developed a very unique and creative way of educating the young, using objects, using imagery, using drama and literature. And they still do it, of course. But we want this kind of education in culture to be available not just to the 400 lucky boys and girls, as it now is, at this school, but to many more of the thousands and upon thousands of children who are going to Catholic schools in England but have no such access to this kind of thing. So I would like to hand over to Jan, who's going to tell you about some of these wonderful things that are in the collection.
Thank you very much. One of the worst things about being a curator is when people start talking about history and dates, you think, oh. So just to come back on Professor Farr's wonderful introduction, Charles II was converted by an old boy. I just thought you'd like to know that, Father Peter. And being a Scot, I will refer to James VII rather than James II. And barely 2 weeks ago, I took a section of his large intestine up to Edinburgh. So I feel that I know His Majesty King James II and VII rather well. Thank you very much, Lord Windsor, for such a wonderful introduction. This is our home. This is where we live now. It's a beautiful Elizabethan house up in the very beautiful and not at all wet Lancashire. We've been there since 1794, but that's not where we started. As you've heard, we started in 1593. And in fact, we started probably a little earlier than that. In 1580, two young English Jesuits who had been trained in Rome and had been working in the continent were commissioned by the Jesuit Father General and by the Pope to return to England as missionaries. So Englishmen going back to their own country to convert and to succor and to give comfort to their own countrymen. This was illegal. It was specifically against the law. And so this pattern of Englishmen being trained abroad and returning to their own country in disguise and under constant fear of denunciation and capture and torture and execution became a pattern. The English Jesuit missionaries were seen by the English Catholics as the greatest hope for the restoration of the faith in England. And during their brief period, Robert Parsons, who you can see on the far side, who was the founder of our school, and his companion, Edmund Campion, on the near side, managed to get round many, many houses, travelling in secret at night, conducted by young men who gave much of their own time and money, and certainly risked their personal liberty, if not more, to protect and carry these two priests around the country. Campion, as we all know, was eventually betrayed, captured, tortured, put through a show trial and various mock debates with Anglican clerics. And on the 1st of December, 1581, he was tied to a wicker hurdle, dragged to Tyburn, and hanged, drawn and quartered. Robert Parsons wasn't in the house when Campion was there, but he managed to escape. Their mission was twofold. Firstly, as I said, to bring comfort and the sacraments to the English Catholics, and secondly, to try and explain to the English government, to their own government, what exactly it was that being Catholic involved, what religious freedom meant to the English Catholics. And this is a very rare copy of Robert Parsons' first book, printed not, as it says at the bottom, Dowie in 1580 by John Lyon, but printed by Robert Parsons and George Gilbert in the back streets of East Ham in London in 1580. And I love the title, A Brief Discourse containing certain reasons why Catholics refuse to go to church. And I think there's probably room for a sequel to this. But in this book, Robert Parsons explained very clearly and eloquently and passionately. He was a wonderful writer. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but there's power and passion pouring off the page. He used this fantastic phrase about heretics who will not see, that they have beetle-blind hearts. And he was trying to explain to his own government, we don't want to go to your state church because it isn't our church. All we want to do is worship our own church. We are loyal subjects of the Queen. We want to be loyal Catholic subjects of the Queen. This book was printed in secret, distributed. Owning it was a capital offence. And this is the consequence for Campion and for many, many of his followers. The engraving there is by Richard Verstegen, the famous printmaker, English printmaker, who worked on the continent disseminating news of what was happening in England, and is based on an eyewitness account. And you can see there Campion being dragged to execution. And the two cylinders that you can see on either side contain relics of those martyrs of the 1580s. The far side has a piece of rope in it. That is the self-same rope that tied Edmund Campion to that wicker hurdle that dragged him from the Tower of London to Tyburn. It was picked up at the scene of execution by a very brave Catholic who we don't know, and smuggled out of England to Robert Parsons, Campion's companion, who had escaped to Rome. Parsons wore it round his waist until he died, and then left it to our school. Now, you can imagine what this means to the pupils of the school. For 420 years, this rope has been part of our worship and part of our witness, and it still is. Every December the 1st, on Campion Day, it comes out. In February, on the feast of our own martyrs, we have 23 martyrs from our college who died for the faith, 3 of whom have been canonized. It comes out. On very special occasions, it also comes out. The piece of cloth that you can see next to it is a corporal, and it was used in the Tower of London by priests condemned to die, to say their last masses. The names are embroidered on it, and what is very poignant is that this was also smuggled out of England and taken to the English College in Rome, where Robert Parsons is working. And he gave it to the Director of Studies and said, have the names of the 5 last priests embroidered on it as a memorial. The Director of Studies was one Robert Southwell, who a few years later returned to England as a missionary and himself was executed. Parsons was never knowingly not energetic. So he decided that having seen the plight of English Catholics, he needed to ensure the continuance of the faith. And as a Jesuit, as a teacher and educator, he knew that that meant a school. This is St. Omer's College. This is the 1685 version. The 1593 version, when the school was founded, burnt down in a fire. So this is the reincarnated St. Omer's of 1685. And this is the school that John and Charles Carroll were so familiar with. This is where they studied, this is where they ate, where they slept, where they worshipped, where they performed in their plays, and where they played their music. And the orchard at the back is where they played football, English football. And Parsons set up this school with the help of Philip of Spain. You can imagine how that went down in England. This is the same Philip of Spain who dispatched the Armada, and Philip of Spain gave it protection because at that point Saint-Omer was part of the Spanish Netherlands. It's now in northern France. And in August 1593, the first 12 boys arrived. Of that class of 12, one turned out to be our first saint, Thomas Garnet, nephew of Henry Garnet, and the other was one of the gunpowder plotters, Ambrose Rookwood. I've often thought, as a teacher, that must have been a challenging class. Lord Nicholas spoke about the Jesuit love of imagery, imago, emblemata, and in fact it was looking for emblemata for this talk that prompted me to discover the Charles Carroll poem, which is a wonderful piece of fortuitousness. Anyway, this is one of my favourite images of all time. This is from a Belgian book published by the Belgian province to mark their first centenary, I think in 1640. It's called the Imago Primi Seculi, images from the first age or the first century. The Belgian Jesuits were rather ticked off about this. They were told off because it was seen to be a little bit sort of vainglorious. Anyway, This is a bear, and as we all know, the famous medieval notion of bears is that their young are born shapeless, formless, like writhing maggots, and the mother bear slowly and with great care and love licks them into shape. And there you see the mother bear, the Jesuit order, licking into shape its formless, maggoty young. We still do. As Lord Nicholas has said, along with the most precious things that English Catholic parents had, their children, they also sent things that they had rescued, or their cousins, or their grandparents, or their uncles, or family members, at great risk during the Reformation. There were several waves of iconoclasm in England. There was the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII. There was another wave of destruction under Edward VI. And then there was a far more thorough series of destructions under Elizabeth I. And if you haven't read Eamon Duffy's wonderful book, The Stripping of the Altars, I strongly recommend you do. This is the very first object, these two garments, the very first objects that came to our school that we know of. We were founded in 1593, and in 1609, these two vestments were in our school, and they were worn by the Vicar Apostolic, who was making a visitation. And he was so moved by their beauty and by their history that he wrote about them. I love people who write things down. It makes my life much easier. These were commissioned by Henry VII for use in Westminster Abbey. And you can see from the imagery, there's a portcullis representing Margaret Beaufort, his mother, and there's the Red Rose of Lancaster, his politics and his family. They were intended for the coronation of Prince Arthur, his son. They were used, in fact, for the coronation of Henry VIII. Henry VIII took them to the Field of Cloth of Gold, and then during the dissolution of the monasteries, two sets, these two identical vestments, were removed by Catholics and hidden away, and by 1609 they were at our school. And the Vicar Apostolic who wore them described them as a rich and rare memorial of England's Catholic past. So even in 1609, they were looking for continuity with the time when it was okay to be a Catholic in England. This is a prayer book. It was made for Mary Tudor. It was made for Mary Tudor in France, in Lyon. She ordered it in March of 1557, and she died in November of that year. The book was not complete. This left the bookbinders in a real quandary because this is a very expensive book. This is expensive silk velvet, and these are solid gold letters. On the front, you see the word Maria, the pomegranate for Catherine of Aragon, and the rose for Henry VIII. And on the back, the coat of arms of Mary Tudor as Queen of England. Luckily for the bookbinders, there was another Catholic queen called Mary with a claim to the throne of England living in France, and that was Mary, Queen of Scots. So this book that belonged to her cousin was the property of Mary, Queen of Scots, and this book was in the hands of Elizabeth Carroll, her lady-in-waiting, on the scaffold at Fotheringay. It was smuggled out of England after Mary was executed, and Elizabeth Carroll's nephew, his Latin name is Hippolytus, but everyone called him Huey, became a Jesuit and then became a librarian. And so that is how the book came to us. So directly from Mary, Queen of Scots, to the Jesuits, and it's still being looked after at the college today. It meant a huge amount to the pupils, because here was a queen, a Catholic, and a martyr. The relics, about which I get obsessional, and I promise I won't go on about them too much, come into four categories, and these were placed on the altar in the Sodality at St. Omer's. The Sodality was dedicated to the conversion of England. Young boys praying and worshipping on top of all their other activities. They were told not to get out of bed before 4 a.m. to go and pray in the chapel because they needed their sleep. And there were four kinds of relics. There was this, the relic of the Passion. This is a piece of a crown of thorns that was given to Mary, Queen of Scots as a wedding present. Given by her to Thomas Percy when she went into exile in England, and given by Thomas Percy when he was executed for trying to put Mary on the throne, to his daughter Elizabeth, who had a Jesuit confessor. It's been on the altar at St. Omer's since 1665, and it still comes out on Good Friday at our school today. Relics of the early church, something that the Catholics of England particularly identified with. This is a piece of the jaw of St. Stephen, which was given to Father John Gerard. And if you haven't read John Gerard's missionary memoirs of a priest dating from around 1609, please do. It is the most wonderful story. And he writes fabulously. So this is a little reliquary that he had set made for it, small. Medieval reliquaries were large and showy. Recusant reliquaries were tiny because they had to be stuck in pockets and hidden in cloaks and smuggled out of England. Very importantly for the recusants, relics of England's medieval Catholic past. This is a beautiful Flemish silver statue of Thomas Becket. You can tell it's Becket because he's got a sword in his head. And So I try not to get flippant. We have another one, which doesn't have a sword in its head, and that's St. Chad. And the brooch-like object that you can see next to it is a piece of Becket's skull, rescued when Becket's remains were destroyed by a Catholic sympathizer and smuggled to John Gerard, who again recorded it, wrote it down, and sent it to our school. And for the boys, Becket, he was in fact the patron of our college, represented all that was right about England's past. And of course, this was an archbishop who stood up to the king for papal authority. So there was double significance there. And then there were the 40 martyrs. Well, there were many, many more than 40. They were the English martyrs. 3 of them in that picture belonged to our school, women and men. And they formed the 4th group, the most poignant and powerful group for the boys, because many of them would be looking at blood-soaked clothing and body parts of people they knew, possibly even family members. This is a hat that belonged to St. Thomas More. It was embroidered by one of his daughters and given to him as a Christmas or New Year's gift towards the end of his life. We know this because Father Thomas More, his last direct male descendant, who provided that crucifix that you can see on the table there, wrote about it. He wrote a letter which we still have in the archives. And it was originally beautiful red and lovely gilding. It's all got rather tarnished now, and it's looking a little bit shabby. The embroidery is not very good. We've got much better stuff. But it was made with love, because this is a present from a child to a parent. This is the right eye of the Blessed Edward Oldcorn, a very gentle missionary priest who worked in Worcester for 18 years undercover and was picked up in the aftermath of the gunpowder plot. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered. Although he had nothing to do with the gunpowder plot, he was still guilty of being a Jesuit priest, and that in itself was worthy of the death penalty. It's gruesome. It's powerful. I've never shown this to a group of children without having had a really good discussion on the nature of cruelty and on the nature of love. And the reason why we keep relics, even apparently grisly relics, like the eyeball, like James II's large intestine, although he left that to us in his will, so that's not quite the same, is ask any parent, do they keep their child's first card? Do you keep your child's first bootie, sock, lock of hair? We keep the things that matter about those we love. And this is the same about those we respect and those who we honour because they gave their lives for their faith. This is the shoulder blade and a single vertebra of one of 4 young men from Durham who went to France to train to be priests. They were not Jesuits. They landed back in England in 1595, and they were picked up instantly. Every port had watchers, and they were looking for priests coming in and young boys going out. And they were dead 8 weeks later. They didn't even have a chance to say a mass in England. We don't know which of the 4 young men. We know their names, and we know much about them, because once the heads are decapitated and the body parts are cut up, and you can see from the arm at the bottom how the blade has sliced through the bone very, very cleanly. These were people who knew what they were doing. So we don't know. We honour it and venerate it in the memory of all 4 of them. And this was on the altar in St. Omer's, and this is the sort of thing that Charles and John Carroll would have had as part of their formation as well. Manuscripts from England's medieval Catholic past, a beautiful 1430 manuscript there showing a pious lady having her portrait included in her own book, and on the other side, a really scruffy and much more, to me, interesting manuscript, the Arma Christi, the Arms of Christ, a poem in English that had indulgences attached to it and was part of the popular piety of Catholic medieval England. Every single aspect of life was governed by your faith. And this not only was a pious poem that could be recited and help to deepen your spirituality, it was also a birthing aid. And women in labour would send for a local woman who had access to an Arma Christi scroll, wrap it round the abdomen during labour, and that explains why there are so few of them left. And this is the book I had hoped to bring. This is the prayer book of Elizabeth Plantagenet. She was the daughter of Edward IV. She was the sister of Edward V. She was the niece of Richard III. She was the wife of Henry VII, and she was the mother of Henry VIII. And the 4 words that you can see there, she inscribed in the back of the book, Elizabeth Plantagenet. That tells us that she was 15 at the time. It tells us that her father was dead, her 2 brothers had vanished in the Tower of London, and her uncle Richard was on the throne, because the first act he did was to strip her of her royal title. He dissolved her parents' marriage and made her illegitimate. Therefore, she could not use her title. That must have hurt. 2-3 years later, when Richard himself was dead, she married Henry, and she went back and wrote her title very firmly, The Queen, underneath. 4 words that tell a very personal story of pain, but also somebody wanted to preserve this, even though this was a book that belonged to the mother of Henry VIII, the cause of all their misfortunes. It was also a book that connected a royal past when kings and queens were Catholic, and that meant a lot. Beautiful 12th century copy of the Homilies of Gregory the Great. This was in the library where Charles and John were growing up, and this would probably have been accessible to them because Jesuits were not like curators, keeping people's hands off things. These were there to be used, and again, to inspire the boys with the fact that in the 12th century, it was okay to be a Catholic and to write about things in Latin. Wonderful vestments. I'll speed up a little bit because I can go on forever. This is a 15th century vestment made for a group of Italian silk merchants in London, the Bonvisi family. Antonio Bonvisi was a very close friend of Thomas More. And what particularly amuses me about this is that the merchant banking family, they're very successful. They made a lot of money, and they probably broke quite a few church canon law in the process. And so Ludovico Bonvisi had this vestment made, but he couldn't resist putting his banking trademark under Our Lady's feet, which rather undoes the whole point. 17th century embroideries. Mary Bodenham, embroidering in honour of her father, Roger Bodenham's cure from cancer at Holywell, the only site of pilgrimage in the whole of England that was in continuous use from before the Reformation and still is to this day. If you're ever in North Wales, I urge you to go to Holywell. It has a beautiful 14th century chapel built over it, a star-shaped pool where Catherine of Aragon bathed in the desperate hope that she'd have a child. It's freezing. And then the wonderful Helena Winter, a great heroine of mine, daughter of one of the gunpowder plotters, who spent her long life embroidering some of the most exquisite embroideries I've ever seen, and on each her faith and her name, her tainted name, the name of a terrorist's daughter. So here you see the heart of Mary pierced with a sword. And here, the dove of the Holy Spirit above the Marian monogram, above Helena's name. And here, AMDG. So she wasn't only sewing for Catholics, she was sewing for Jesuits. She sheltered Jesuits. And below it, HW, her own name. She wasn't afraid of nailing her colours to the mast. Making vestments alone would have probably ended her up in prison. Sheltering priests would have meant her death. And the most beautiful, beautiful work. Jesuits are a worldwide order. Here we see Matteo Ricci and an ivory scientific instrument used by his successor in China, Father von Schall, a German astronomer and Jesuit, indicating the practical nature of the Jesuits, using science and using local culture to allow them to reach out to people. A beautiful mid-17th century Andean school painting showing Mary holding the Christ child and an Inca sacrificial axe, this idea of enculturation, which was what made the Jesuits such successful missionaries. A bell from the missions in Brazil that was suppressed in the 18th century. This little brass bell was used at the Mass in St. George reduction in northern Brazil, one of the first Jesuit reductions to be set up, and was smuggled out of South America. And by this stage, it was obvious that the only place to send these things to was to our school, because this was the one safe place where all these Catholic objects could be looked after and their significance recognised. We still use this bell at Mass. And then the school book. A very, very turgid book of poems by Matthias Casimir. One of these days I'm going to regret saying that because I'll read them and actually like them. And you can see from the inscription there, Bibliotheca Scholastica, the school, the scholars' library. And then underneath, second in the class of syntax, John Carroll, 1751. Very honest of him. And underneath that, his cousin's signature. So he passed the book to his younger cousin. I love the fact that Charles Carroll is always referred to in our school archives of the time as Charlie. And we have many, many records of Charles Carroll's father sending money from Maryland through a London agent and then up to the school. And these were all lovingly inscribed and written down in the great big book that made sure that no child was allowed to leave until they'd paid their fees. And Charlie Carroll liked fishing because we have records for his father sending money for a fishing rod. And it's lovely little details like that that make human history. Also human history, this is the frontispiece to the same book, which I'll change the page and you can come and have a look at it. And either your august first Archbishop of America or your signer of the Declaration of Independence in their youth thought it was funny to stick pipes on the mouth of the poetry muse. And even more shockingly, in between the Barberini bees. I think it was the Archbishop myself. And, you know, maybe it was this very intensely classical education, this long reading of Latin poems, that made John Carroll determined that Americans should be able to worship God in their own language and not just in Latin. This is a section from the poem, which I'll read maybe a little bit in a minute if I've got time. Charles Carroll, aged 17, was invited to give a declamation, one of these great public sort of set pieces that the Jesuits expected of their pupils, teaching them discipline, of oratory, self-confidence, and also they'd write them themselves. It's written in Latin. And St. Cecilia was the patron saint of the year that he was in, and this was to be proclaimed on her feast day. And he took the role of the Roman prefect who condemned her to death, Turcus Almachius, and wrote a long letter to St. Cecilia in which he begged her to compromise her principles, to carry the gods on her lips and Christ in her heart. And it's a wonderful piece of intelligent, sophisticated understanding of the corrosiveness of compromise and the necessity for truth. As you read this poem, you can see how Charles Carroll has really got himself into character. You want to smack the man. He's so slimy, Almachus. And at the end, the last line is, you know, give in, you're beautiful, you're young, you're pretty, everything good will come to you, riches and wealth and so on, and it'll help me out too. So the poem is there, I do urge you to read it. And finally, one of the wonderful things that John Carroll did for our school was to rescue many of the most important relics that we had. In 1773, the Jesuit order was suppressed. Politics, the French, Spanish and Portuguese governments, all manner of internal politics, which I won't go into, meant that every Jesuit institution was obliterated. The Jesuits were removed, they were not allowed to call themselves Jesuits, and their possessions were forfeit. So the Empress Maria Theresa sent her inventors around to the college to take a list of everything. It's a wonderful document. Everything that was in the school on the night of the suppression is recorded. All of the priests' bedrooms, their contents are recorded. Most of them own a couple of books, a chair, a bed, a desk, a holy picture. Father John Carroll, because when he left the school, he joined the Jesuit order, as you know, he came back to our school as a teacher. Father John Carroll's bedroom is stuffed with expensive and valuable and precious things. Silver teapots, swords, books, holy pictures, relics, and this, the body of St. Gordianus, the martyr from the 4th century, who was the patron of our sodality, and he understood how much importance the pupils attached to the sodality, which was the organ, if you like, the engine for the conversion of England. And somehow, and it's jolly heavy, he managed to get it into his bedroom, trusting in the fact that his American nationality would exempt him from some of the more stringent sort of carryings out of the law of sequestration. And so it proved to be. So thanks to John Carroll very much for saving St. Gordianus. And thank you very much for listening. And I do hope that I can encourage you to visit us at Stonyhurst, to come and see the wonderful treasures of which you've seen a tiny, tiny fragment, and to be part of this great outpouring of faith and freedom and religious liberty, which we teach to our children still very much today. Thank you.
Well, we've heard something about John Carroll defacing books, but let's begin, if we may, with a prayer that John Carroll himself wrote in 1791. Forgive me for my voice, but some of you who heard me a couple of days ago will realize it's gradually catching me up. I think it's somewhere still above the Atlantic, but en route to America. So in a croaky voice, but nevertheless, I hope you'll be able to hear me and understand what I'm saying. First, then, this prayer written in 1791, which he asked should be recited in parishes throughout his diocese. And I think it's very appropriate because it's a prayer for Congress, where we were this morning. It's a prayer for the President. It's a prayer about the upholding of Christian values. We pray thee, O God of might, wisdom and justice, through whom authority is rightly administered, laws are enacted, and judgment decreed. Assist with thy Holy Spirit of counsel and fortitude the President of these United States, but his administration may be conducted in righteousness and be eminently useful to thy people over whom he presides, by encouraging due respect for virtue and religion, by a faithful execution of the laws in justice and mercy, and by restraining vice and immorality. Let the light of thy divine wisdom direct the deliberations of Congress, and shine forth in all the proceedings and laws framed for our rule and government, so that they may tend to the preservation of peace, the promotion of national happiness, the increase of industry, sobriety, and useful knowledge, and may perpetuate to us the blessing of equal liberty. We recommend likewise to thy unbounded mercy all our brethren and fellow citizens throughout the United States, that they may be blessed in the knowledge and sanctified in the observance of thy most holy law, that they may be preserved in union, and that the peace which the world cannot give, and after enjoying the blessings of this life, be admitted to those which are eternal. And we make this prayer today, perhaps all of us in our hearts as well, in the name of John Carroll, but in our own names as well, to the Almighty God. Paul Johnson, who wrote the History of the American People, was an alumni of Stonyhurst College. He said the Christian Heritage Centre project, which Lord Nicholas and Jan Graffius have been describing to you, is an adventurous and valuable attempt to bring many precious objects into a coherent and historical narrative. It deserves the support of everyone who values Christian truth. If you have the chance, have a look at the new website launched to coincide this week with this visit to the United States. It's at www.christianheritage.com. And we also will have, I think, copies of some of the brochures and pamphlets available immediately after the talk for you to have a look at, so that it gives you some idea of what the project is trying to achieve. If any of you are in a position to assist the project, we would love to hear from you. We want to create a study centre, a retreat centre, and a visitors centre, where, as Nicholas said, some of the 800,000 children in our Catholic schools in England, but beyond that too, the many, many others who have lost their story, lost their identity, will be able to come and be inspired by some of the things that Jan has described to us today. We have more than 40,000 volumes in our archive. The kind of poem that Jan has mentioned was only recently rediscovered, hadn't been recited in public since the 18th century when Charles Carroll wrote it. So here is a treasure house for the whole world. It celebrates, if you like, the Catholic pilgrimage that took place between Maryland and the continent and back again, as more than a third of the school at that time were people from the United States, and I think over a third of those became priests or religious, and as Jan has described. So the giving of gifts to one another, the Catholic American Pilgrim Fathers, if you will, something here to celebrate our story, your story too. And I hope, therefore, that you'll have a look at the website, see if there's anything at all that you can do to assist. I've mentioned that at the outset because I won't come back to it. My purpose today, is the brief I've been given by Professor Farr, is to locate the historic story of persecution and suffering, the things that we've heard about, the cross of Thomas More, which is here, which he venerated before he was taken to die on Tower Green outside the Tower of London, the tiny fragment of Edmund Campion's alb, which is here, which commemorates a man who was hung, drawn and quartered at Tyburn Marble Arch in London, both of whom refused to renounce their religious liberty, their faith, their conscience, their right to hold the beliefs that they held. More famously said at Westminster Hall, where I've been privileged to work over these last 3 decades, first in the Commons, then in the Lords. I walk through that hall every day. And More and Campion both tried there. More said, "I am the king's good servant, but God's first. I'm the king's good servant, but God's first." He knew what his priorities were. He knew what the Rubicon was that he could not cross. And I think many of us, steeped in PC political correctness rather than PC political courage, need to remember and be inspired by those words. But I can't help thinking as well that Campion and Moore and the others who were tried there would have been rejoicing from their celestial vantage points when Pope Benedict came to Westminster Hall 2 years ago, and where he made a declaration in that hall calling for religious pluralism, religious tolerance, and religious respect. In other words, the faith that is worth dying for might be a faith worth living for. We are meeting in the aftermath of the worst slaughter of Christians in our times. And it's wonderful that Paul Marshall and Nina Shea from Freedom House, whom I've been privileged to work with over the years, great champions of religious liberty, their new book, Persecuted, is available. I really would recommend it to you. It's wonderful that we were able to be at Congress this morning with people like Congressman Chris Smith, who has just got back from Nigeria and who's done so much, and with whom I've worked over the years on some of these issues. We were saying to one another, how can the world be so silent about Nigeria, where Boko Haram only this weekend went into a dormitory and murdered 50 young students, just like those who will be studying here at Georgetown, innocent young people, because Boko Haram means that Western education and influence should be eradicated. That's what it actually means, and that is what they're doing. This is a terrorist organization, which is why we in the United Kingdom have prescribed it. And Nina and Paul and others are working for it to be prescribed in the United States too, and I hope that that will happen soon. But think about Pakistan, where just 2 weeks ago, 80 Christians coming out of church, a thing we take for granted, the right to religious freedom, to celebrate Mass, to be able to go to Vespers, to pray our prayers, the things that we take for granted, these good, innocent folk were doing. They're just 1% of the entire population of Pakistan. And where were the police? Where were the judicial authorities? Where was anybody to protect them? And in that culture of impunity, these people were gunned down and murdered as they peacefully left their church after a communion service. Where is the rule of law in finding the assassins who murdered Shahbaz Bhatti, whose brother Paul I was with just a couple of weeks ago in London? Shahbaz Bhatti, who was the Catholic minister for minorities and who was murdered because he refused to back down. Yes, he was the king's good servant, but God's first. He said he would work for a society in which minorities would be respected and where people had the right to believe in, or indeed not to believe. He said that his stand on their behalf, his words, would send a message of hope to the people living a life of despair, of disappointment, disillusionment, and despair, adding that his life was, I quote, dedicated to the oppressed, the downtrodden, and the marginalized, something very close to the heart of our first Jesuit Pope, Pope Francis. And he said to the struggle for human equality, social justice, religious freedom, and the empowerment of religious minorities, communities. Following his murder, Pope Benedict prayed, and I quote, I ask the Lord Jesus that the moving sacrifice of Shahbaz Bhatti may arouse in people's consciences the courage and commitment to defend religious freedom and human dignity. Think also of what is happening in Syria, where Christian communities which have been there for 2,000 years, the Syrianis speaking the ancient Aramaic language of our Lord himself, are caught between a genocidal regime and an equally ruthless set of Islamist militants in the so-called opposition. Or think of Egypt, where ancient communities are being threatened, bombed, intimidated, and eradicated. Think of Sudan. When I went into Tom's office earlier on, my eye focused immediately on his picture with Bishop Makram Gassis, one of the great heroes. Makram Gassis, who is the bishop in the Nuba Mountains, South Kordofan, Blue Nile, are suffering day by day by day from aerial bombardment. My courageous colleague, Baroness Caroline Cox, was there recently. Go to her website and see for yourself what is happening, not just historically, but happening in our own times. Christianity faces being wiped out of the biblical heartlands in the Middle East because of mounting persecution of worshippers. And that campaign of assassination and asphyxiation is a silent genocide. It's estimated that as many as 100,000 Christians lose their life for their faith every year. Put another way, during the hour or so we've been here already, that's about 11 more fatalities. Yet these contemporary tie-bins are frequently unreported and unremarked. I was thinking, when preparing these remarks, of what happened in November 1938, when, in an orgy of violence, which would be known as Kristallnacht, Jewish synagogues, homes, hospitals, schools were ransacked and pillaged. The sledgehammers and petrol left more than 1,000 synagogues burnt and over 7,000 Jewish shops and businesses in ruins. The streets were covered in shards of smashed glass from broken windows. Now compare the charred husk of Fassenhaustrasse, the synagogue in Berlin in 1938, with the pictures that we've seen on the internet and on our TV screens of the blackened walls of Degler's ruined church of the Virgin Mary, which was ransacked and burnt just 6 weeks ago in Egypt. And you'll readily understand why August 2013 represents Egypt's Kristallnacht. Compare the terror of 1938 with the fear of Copts as members of their community have been left dead, others assaulted, and their 118th Pope, Tawadros II, who's now under protection, having had death threats made against him. In 1938, the Times newspaper in London commented, I quote, "No foreign propagandist bent upon blackening Germany before the world could outdo the tales of burnings and beatings, of blackguardly assaults on defenceless and innocent people, which disgraced that country yesterday." In August 2013, in an almost identical vein, the Times reported, again their words, "Dozens of churches, homes and businesses have been set alight and looted in Egypt, forcing millions of Christians into hiding amid the worst bout of sectarian violence in the country's modern history. Some Coptic Christian communities are being made to pay bribes as local Islamists exploit the turmoil by seeking to revive a 7th century tax called jizya levied on non-Muslims." And the Sunday Times reported how in one village, first they daubed the Christians' shops and homes with a red cross. Then the mob stormed the police station before turning its wrath on the church. Friends, more than 90 churches, monasteries and church buildings have been attacked across that one country alone. The Times said that there had been incitement, that imams in the town of Fayoum reportedly urged supporters to go out and attack churches and Christians. In Cairo, Franciscan nuns saw the cross over their school gate torn down and replaced by an Al-Qaeda flag, while the school was burnt down and 3 nuns were frog-marched through the streets while mobs showered them with abuse. One nun said, "They paraded us like prisoners of war." It took one of my great heroes, the outgoing British Chief Rabbi, Jonathan Sacks, Lord Sacks, always mindful, of course, himself of the events to which Kristallnacht led, to point to our indifference to the assault on the Copts, which he described, his words, as a tragedy going almost unremarked and is the religious equivalent of ethnic cleansing. In another context, Jonathan also said, talking about Auschwitz, he said, "Don't ask where was God at Auschwitz. Don't ask where was God at Auschwitz. Ask where was man. Where was man? And where are we? Where are we? When you consider what is happening to other members of a household of faith, our brothers and sisters, why is it that there's so much silence in the face of so much suffering? Is it because we who have free speech and the privilege of living in a democratic society have forgotten who we are? The prophet Isaiah reminds us that you should never forget the rock from which you are hewn. Never forget the rock from which you are hewn. Have we forgotten? And in the book of Deuteronomy, we're told to remember the days of old. Consider the generations long ago. Ask your father to recount it and your elders to tell you the tale. That's what we've been doing today. St. Gordianus. Think of the horrors of the persecution of Diocletian and Nero. 100,000 people lost their lives at that time, about the number who are losing their lives each year in our own times. Knowing who we are and knowing our personal and family story is one of the reasons why the New Testament contains a detailed genealogy through which Jesus traces all his forebears. Knowing who you are and cherishing your communities and your family's narrative is an essential part of your own makeup. Knowing who you are gives knowledge, security and confidence, and the absence of this knowledge sows seeds of insecurity and instability. The oracle at Delphi offered the wise advice to Lydian, the king of King Croesus, know thyself and you will know how to live. King Croesus has asked the question, what's the most important thing for me to know? Know thyself and you will know how to live. The deep desire to know the rock from which we've been hewn undoubtedly explains why television programs in the United Kingdom, such as Who Do You Think You Are? And genealogy sites are so popular. The importance of knowing your story, who you are, is not a new urge or a need identified by modern psychiatry. Central to the Jewish community's celebration of Pesach or Passover is a 3,300-year-old ritual which involves a child questioning an adult about the Jewish story, the Haggadah. It's a story which Jews say begins with the bread of affliction and ends with the wine of freedom. It's a loving act of remembering, and through more than 100 generations of Jews, they've handed on their story to their children, but we've often forgotten ours. The word Haggadah means to relate, to tell, to expound, but it also means to bind, to join, to connect. The old stories then bind one generation to the next, connecting the past with the present and the future, joining people of the present with their community throughout the world and throughout time. And above all, the telling of the story honours the presence of God in the affairs of mankind. Being deprived of your story, I think, is a most serious deprivation. It's one of the reasons why I opposed legislation passed in Britain. Austin Roos is here, who does so much wonderful work for the unborn. Imagine a decision by a parliament to remove from the name of from the birth certificate, the official document of who you are, the names of your biological parents, so that any two people can put their names. This is a deceit. It's undermining people's knowledge of who they are. So be clear, when we fail to reappropriate and tell the story of those who gave their lives, we might be free to believe. When we fail to locate the story of the English martyrs, the Tyburn story, in today's continuing worldwide struggle for religious freedom, we create freedom without virtue. And whether it's in the culture of the City of London or the new rampant materialism we're seeing in China, freedom without virtue has disastrous consequences. From the crucifixion of our Lord himself to the stoning to death of Stephen, from the execution of Peter and Paul, the early disciples, to the deaths of those 100,000 at the hands of Nero and Diocletian, to the executions of penal times and the mass murders of the bloodied 20th century, when more people lost their lives for their faith than in all the previous centuries combined, we have a precious narrative entrusted to us, our own Haggadah, and which must be passed to those who follow. As a great British-American poet, I think we can both claim a little bit of T.S. Eliot, wrote, and we've heard about Thomas à Becket a few moments ago, wrote of the murder of Thomas à Becket in Canterbury Cathedral. Wherever a saint has dwelt, wherever a martyr has given his blood for Christ, there is holy ground, and the sanctity shall not depart from it. In England, at Tyburn, today's Marble Arch, between 1535 and 1681, 105 Catholic men and women gave their lives to their faith, a sacrifice which paved the way for the religious freedoms and liberties which we enjoy today. And perhaps the story, because we know how it mutates, how it develops, with the emancipation of Catholics and Jews, for instance, in 1829, with the lifting of the ban of Catholic students going to Oxford and Cambridge universities by the end of the 19th century, though we still have a ban on a Catholic being able to become the monarch in England. You could be an atheist, you could be a Muslim, you could be a lot of things, but you can't be a Catholic. A fairly minor thing in some ways, and one day it will no doubt be put right. We have made extraordinary progress, and there is some hope, therefore, for the beleaguered and besieged peoples that I've been describing. Let me be clear, I don't believe in theocracy, and I would go to the scaffold myself, I hope, for the principle that a man must, or a woman must be free not to believe in God. But paradoxically, the new ideology of angry atheism would deny to believers the right to pray in a public place, to preach openly what they believe, or even the right to wear a necklace or a cross around your neck. The late Christopher Hitchens, author of God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything, claimed that religion is, I quote, the main source of hatred in the world. Dawkins asserts that the crimes committed by Stalin and Hitler were not attributable to their atheism, but because they were able to manipulate people's religious sentiments. Well, de Tocqueville better understood human impulses and the nature of evil when he argued with passion that religion is central for the upholding of freedom itself. All who love liberty, he said, should hasten to call religion to their aid, for they must know that the reign of freedom cannot be established without that of mores, not mores founded without beliefs. Be clear, when we fail to reappropriate them and tell the story of those who gave their lives that we might be free to believe, when we fail to locate the martyr's story in today's continuing worldwide struggle for freedom, we create freedom without virtue. Suppression of religious belief simultaneously dishonors memory, and in robbing our children of their own story, we rob them of their identity. Shami Chakrabarti, the admirable director of Liberty in Britain, a secular organisation, put the same thought into the domestic context in the UK when she said, "The Christian's right to wear a cross must be defended as fiercely as any other religious liberty. The struggle for religious freedom has been strongly connected with the struggle for democracy itself." Amnesty International is right when it asserts that the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion is a fundamental component of the universal and indivisible human rights framework that applies to all people everywhere as laid out in international law. Last year, with my colleague Lady Cox and my friend Baroness Berridge, we created at Westminster a new all-party group to promote religious freedom. And in doing so, we cited the 1948 Declaration on Human Rights, and specifically Article 18. And we recently published a report, we've given copies to Congressmen this morning, entitled Article 18, An Orphaned Right. What did we mean by that? We meant it's a right that is now honoured in the breach. These are the words from the 1948 Declaration. We hear about every other right under the sun. You know, I think sometimes when a seal arrives at Westminster holding a placard saying save the human race, or even more likely a fox, and then the British Parliament will see the paradox of some of the concerns that it has. Article 18 said, everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship and observance. In 2011, speaking in Westminster Hall, where, as I said, Moore and Campion were tried, Pope Benedict Emeritus said that the difficult dilemma which faced Moore in those difficult times was the perennial question of the relationship between what is owed to Caesar and what is owed to God. And he went on to say that we devalue ourselves when we devalue religious belief, that we undermine the very fabric and basis of our society when we try to drive out of the public square those things that we can connect all the way back to the Haggadah, to Judeo-Christian beliefs. Edmund Campion, when he stood, that great Jesuit martyr, I'm wearing my Campion tie today in his honour here at Georgetown. I was educated, I'm the typical son of an immigrant. Jan mentioned the Scots. Nicholas mentioned, of course, the English. Let me mention the Irish, because my late mother was Irish. Her first language was Irish. My father was a desert rat and fought for the British Army. And my grandfather, too, in 2 world wars, alongside American servicemen. But my late mother encouraged me at school to work hard. And the good Sisters of Mercy, who gave me my primary school education, said I should try and get through a scholarship to get into a brand new school that was being created for kids like me off the local council estate. And it was to be named after Edmund Campion, whom I'd, at that stage as an 11-year-old, I'd never really heard of. So I learnt the story of Edmund Campion, and I got into that school in its first year. It's 50 years old this year, and this is the tie that they gave me when they asked me to come and do the school prize giving a few weeks ago to commemorate its 50 years. The school motto, yes, we have AMDG, but the school motto is Auctore Deo. These are Campion's words. He said, the enterprise is reckoned, the enterprise is begun. It is of God, it cannot be withstood. So the faith was planted, so it must be restored. So the enterprise is of God, and it will succeed. And it's up to us who are here not to expect God to do all these things for us, but to be like Wilberforce, who for 40 years changed hearts and minds in order to bring about changes in the law. That's what Pope Francis is telling us to do, to go out and evangelize, to take out the gospel of life, and to change the culture of death, to change hearts and minds so that legislative change can come. During the time since I left school, I went to Liverpool. I studied there and ended up as the youngest member of the Commons and then in the Lords. I helped to found Jubilee Campaign, which is a campaign dedicated to religious freedom. It takes its name from the Bible, a time when fields will be left fallow to regain their goodness, a time when unfair burdens of debt will be removed, and a time when prisoners who are unjustly held will be freed. Amber Walder, who runs Jubilee here in the States, has just got back from a fact-finding visit in Nigeria, where she and Chris Smith have been, and does an extraordinarily good job. During the time that I've been connected with Jubilee and with Christian Solidarity Worldwide, Aid to the Church in Need, wonderful organisations, I've been privileged to meet some of the modern contemporary heroes for the faith, who have reckoned the price and have paid it. I think of the Ukraine, where I met Bishop Pavlo Vasilek, who'd spent 17 years in prison, and Evangel, who was the chairman of the Committee for the Defence of the Church in the Ukraine, who'd been 18 years in prison. Even while we had supper together before the fall of communism, the KGB arrived to check out the dinner list. The four of us who were there, wanting to know what we were up to, what was going on. The young priest who was with us, who couldn't be officially a priest. The bishop who was actually a collector of herbs, his official designation. The priest who was officially a stoker of boilers. He just returned from Chernobyl, where he'd been caught celebrating, because he'd been caught celebrating the liturgies, and he'd been sent there as a punishment without any protective clothing because of what he had done, which was still illegal in Ukraine in those days. I think of the elderly villager in Nepal who'd walked for 2 weeks to give me his first-hand account of how he'd been brutally beaten after refusing to renounce his faith, the nun who'd been put in the stocks, or the Indian nun in Orissa who was raped in an orgy of violence. I think of Bishop Akio Johnson in Sudan, who showed me what had been his home, church, school and clinic, all obliterated by Sudanese bombers. Or the great Romanian bishop, Cardinal Todia, who'd languished for years in communist prisons. Or the Orthodox dissident, Alexander Ogorodnikov, whose book I recently helped to launch in London, and who was kept in solitary confinement in a Soviet jail because he'd organised a Christian renewal movement. Or of Lech Wałęsa and his Polish solidarity workers, the inspiration of the Cardinal Archbishop of Krakow, the future John Paul II, Blessed John Paul II, the Assyrian and Chaldean Catholics hanging on by their fingertips in southeast Turkey, and the dignity of the Karen Christian tribes, or the people of Burma whom I visited earlier this year and met with Aung San Suu Kyi, or the people in North Korea. I just published a book about North Korea. It's a Kindle version if anybody's interested. There are 2 chapters on Christianity in Korea, where there were 8,000 Christian martyrs. 8,000 Christian martyrs. The price has been reckoned and it has been paid. Let me end by, if I may, just quoting some words of Dr. Martin Luther King. He said, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. We will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. In remembering the price that has been paid, let's not forget what is happening today. Help us to ensure, through this Christian Heritage Centre, that we can tell the story of persecution in the past, but contemporary intolerance today, that we can do more to uphold this orphaned right, Article 18, the right to religious freedom, and pass to this next generation their story, their Haggadah. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much to all three of you for those stirring presentations. We've covered an awful lot here, and I want to give a little time for question and answer. So do we have a mic? Oh, we're going to use this one. Okay. So if you would like to ask a question, right behind you there, if you would identify yourself, please, and then ask your question.
My name is Joe McPherson. A comment first that Father Andrew White, who was the apostle to Maryland, came over on the Ark and Dove, was the first class of St. Omer's. Yes, and he was converted the Indians, and then in the time of plundering during the English Civil War, he was sent back in chains with a fellow Jesuit to England, and the two other Jesuits here. We just found in the last 10 years from a Dutch diary of a ship, log of a ship, that they were sentenced to be left on a deserted island to face either the natives, the more fierce natives to the north, or by exposure to the enemy. Also, I'm surprised that you didn't mention Daniel Carroll, who was the brother of John Carroll and the cousin of Charles Carroll, through their mother, not through the Carroll side, by the way. Anyway, he was the one that signed the Articles of Confederation for Maryland. He was a signer of the Constitution. He participated and had made some important contributions to it. He was the first congressman from Maryland. He helped set up the federal district, and he was quite an important figure. Some of the wording in the First Amendment on religious freedom actually comes from him. Yes, and he made some important contributions on the people. He introduces the word to the people, rights not, delegated to the federal government, reserved to the people, things like that. So thirdly, I thought you had sold the poem of St. Cecilia of Charles Carroll to the Maryland Historical Society. Well, I saw that. I assure you, it's in our archives. Did he write? Did he write too? I don't know. And I'd had others, but I'll go on.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that.
If I could just thank you.
Yeah.
I would have loved to have talked for a lot longer. Thank you. I would have loved to have talked for a lot longer. I could bore you for hours on what we look after. There were, in fact, 10 Carrolls who came to St. Omer's, and a number of Maryland families. As I said, about 130 altogether. And the Maryland particularly, but the American contingent was a very important part. And we're proud of each and every one of them. The last Carroll came to Stonyhurst in the 1930s. So
very good.
If any of them would like to come back.
We had one this morning, actually, at the conference. Adam Carter.
Okay. Other questions or comments? Jerry Gilbin, right here.
I'm just curious as to the progress of the Ordinariate of Our Lady of Walsingham in the United Kingdom today.
Perhaps you could tell us first a little bit about the Our Lady of Walsingham and a little background.
Yes, well, the Ordinariate is a beautiful initiative of our emeritus Pope, where he wanted to respond to an approach from a group of Anglicans who asked if he could find a way to a place for them within the Catholic Church, but which allowed them to retain some of the real Catholic patrimony that was in the Anglican tradition. And he created this ordinariate for them, which has about 80 priests in England, I think, and a few thousand members. And they now use most of the Book of Common Prayer for Catholic worship, matins and evensong. And now they are about to celebrate Holy Mass for the first time using a liturgy which again draws its language from not just the prayer book, but from, I imagine, perhaps the Sarum Missal or something like that. So they will be using a truly English missal with these pre-Reformation elements in it. So they're going along. They're trying to. They have a mother church now in London. They have not enough money to pay their clergy. Many of them brought their families. Of course, they lost their livings, their stipends. So it's been quite tough, I think, for a lot of them. But it's carrying on. And I don't know much about the American ordinariate. Yeah. Yes. We met a priest here yesterday of the ordinariate.
Roughly 4,500 Anglican priests that have
Yes, of course.
Yes, you're quite right to refer beyond the ordinariate to the number of people who have become Catholic in the last 20 years. And that does include between 400 and 500 Anglican clergy. So they're not part of the ordinariate. These are people already who'd become Catholic and are serving in many of our parishes. And I think it was really the example that they have given, I must say, of great reverence, of commitment, and often working in incredibly poor neighbourhoods, that has inspired. I think it led to the Vatican deciding this has been so good that we must make it easier for people not to have to leave behind things that have been precious to them, their own liturgies especially, and to be able to bring those things into the great body of the Catholic Church. And I suppose having visited places like the Ukraine, where of course the Greek Catholics have their own liturgies, they have married clergy, though not married bishops, so very like the Orthodox Church, but are in full communion with us. It's not, the ordinariate is not so very different, in my view, from the relationship with the Greek Catholics. I'll just add one other thing, and that's about Walsingham itself, because it was St. Philip Howard who wrote a poem when he was himself in the Tower of London, saying that when Our Lady returned to Walsingham, then England would return to the church. And it's interesting for me that Philip Howard had apostatized. He had left the Catholic Church, but he was present in the Tower when another convert, Edmund Campion, who was known as the greatest scholar in England at the time of Elizabeth I, had come back to England, had now been arrested, and he was interrogated, tortured in the Tower. And under interrogation, Howard heard him defending his faith. And he was so inspired that he returned to the Catholic Church. And of course, that family have given us the Earl Marshals, the leading aristocratic family in Britain, the Dukes of Norfolk, ever since that time. So Campion, the price he paid, but the effect he had, even on someone like Philip Howard, who himself, and as I say, would die in the Tower of London and become a Catholic saint. It was extraordinary, and I'm not surprised, therefore, that Walsingham has meant so much to those making this journey back into full communion with the Catholic Church.
Hello, my name is Stephen Damari, and first of all, thank you for being here. I had the opportunity to see St. Philip Howard's shrine in Arundel in 2010, and that was great joy. I just wondered if you could say a little bit about the history and the current status of the pro-life movement in the United Kingdom. It's not something I know very much about.
The very first speech that Nicholas gave in public after becoming a Catholic was on pro-life questions. And I know that he was anxious before giving the speech because he said, I'm not used to doing this. And I said to him afterwards, well, it sounded to me as though you've been doing it all your life. It was a wonderful defense of the unborn. And I just want to put on record that when we launched, in fact, at Austin's request, the San Jose articles at Westminster, Nicholas came all the way to Westminster from Italy in order to be able to be there to affirm what was being done. The situation in Britain is that since 1967, when the Abortion Act was passed, there have been around 7 million abortions. That runs now at around 600 every day. 1 in 5 pregnancies ends in an abortion. We have abortion up to and even during birth, in the case of a child with a disability. In all other cases, up to 24 weeks. What has that led to? 90%, these are the official figures, 90% of all babies with Down syndrome are now eliminated in the womb. So the amniocentesis test and so on becomes like the first part of a search and destroy mission. This legislation has then led on to experiments on human embryos. More than 3 million human embryos have now been destroyed or experimented on. We even passed legislation allowing scientists to create animal-human hybrid embryos. When you start devaluing life and say that it doesn't really matter, it's just a choice, then all these things flow from it. So far we've prevented the legalization of euthanasia. We don't have anything like the Oregon laws yet, but assisted dying is coming. We've had 3 bills before the House of Lords, all of which we've defeated so far. But a new one is coming forward, being brought forward by a former Lord Chancellor, and perhaps it's worth comparing Lord Faulkner, the former Lord Chancellor, with Thomas More, who was a Lord Chancellor of England as well. And the contrast in many ways couldn't be greater. That bill is coming forward again in the next few weeks. On the ground, we have some wonderful pro-life organisations. I particularly would highlight Life, Care and Right to Life. Right to Life is a campaigning organisation which the late Phyllis Spowman founded, and a great, great woman. Life is led by Professor Jack Scarisbrick, whom I know Tom deeply admires because of his extraordinary academic work many years ago in writing the best biography of Henry VIII and the events. In fact, Eamon Duffy's book, which was referred to earlier on, is very much based on Jack Scarisbrick's work. But he and his wife founded the Life organisation, which has more than 90 life houses and offices and 2 baby hospices as well, all of which have been created so that we can genuinely say we're not just against things, we are positively pro-life for a woman and a child. It's a relentless, long battle. It wins you no friends and no favours. It's one of those litmus tests almost in politics. And this slogan, my right to choose. G.K. Chesterton, in his book Orthodoxy in 1906, said, "To admire mere choice is to refuse to choose." To admire mere choice is to refuse to choose. Me, my, I, at the heart of the equation. Rights, not duties or responsibilities. Choice, not the consequences. Freedom for the pike becomes death for the minnow. So it's our job, surely, to speak out for the voiceless, for the powerless, and to confront the destruction of life wherever we see it. And that, I think, has to come through a softening of hearts. And this is why I think Pope Francis is so right in saying we have to re-evangelize our nations, take the gospel of life to them, and then hopefully we'll change laws, which is what happened in England at the end of the 18th century. John and Charles Wesley, George Whitefield, and then later on in the 19th century, the Tractarian movement, the Oxford movement, and then John Henry Newman and Cardinal Manning, they brought about the religious renewal of the British nation. That led, after 40 years, to William Wilberforce being able to get through Parliament his abolition of slavery, my right to choose to own another person as a slave. Wilberforce changed hearts, and then he changed minds. It couldn't have happened without the religious renewal which preceded it. So I think that is what Francis is asking us to do as well in our own time, to challenge people in their hearts and minds, and then to see if we can't change the laws and attitudes that must flow from that. Is that enough?
Very good. Well, we have time for one more question right here.
Donna Bethel. Lord Alton, so many of the examples of contemporary persecutions of Christians that you cited were in Muslim countries. And it's clear that Islamists are leading the charge against Christians, anyone who isn't a Muslim. Is there any specific response, besides the general argument for human dignity and freedom, is there any specific response that should be made to that type of persecution?
I was very struck in listening to Chris Smith this morning at Congress, having just got back from Jos, but he said how struck he'd been by some of the imams that he'd met and by some of the, as it were, ordinary Muslims he'd met who were themselves proclaiming the need for toleration and their opposition to the violence which has been perpetrated by people like Boko Haram. But just think of Kenya. A couple of weeks ago in the shopping mall there, the Al-Shabaab organization, which comes from Somalia, is almost identical to Boko Haram. The Wahhabism that has flowed out of Saudi Arabia has been responsible for the radicalization of those Sunni Muslims. And of course, if you live in a country like Egypt and you're a Shia Muslim, then you're going to be on the receiving end of it too. Think of what happened in Mali, where all of the Sufi shrines and the burial places of their dead have been desecrated and destroyed, even though these are other Muslims. So Muslims are on the receiving end too. So we need to create alliances and coalitions to challenge these things. But as one Syrian Christian said last week, how can you have a dialogue with those who are actually carrying out these atrocities? So don't misunderstand what I'm saying. There are radical organizations, and the idea that the White House, or the British government for that matter, should aid and abet and support some of the organizations and the militants who are involved in this Salafist organizations and in the Brotherhood and so on. This, to my mind, beggars belief. You know, you need, certainly in the United Kingdom, and I think even in the United States, you need a license to hold a firearm. But what would you be doing, handing over the most extraordinary volatile material and dangerous weapons into the hands of people who themselves say they want to impose Sharia laws, which leads to the execution of gays, it leads to the imprisonment of women. Look what happens in Iran, where women are hung from public cranes if they've committed social crimes. It leads to the execution of Baha'is. It leads to all sorts of atrocities. So this is a huge, huge issue. It is the great issue of our time. And that's why Pope Benedict was right at Regensburg when he gave his address there. When he said, and this wasn't a miscalculation, it wasn't a mistake, he asked the historic question. He said, what has changed from the conversation between the Caliph and the Emperor? What has changed in the intervening 1500 years? Is it compatible for Islam to live in coexistence alongside Christians and people of no belief or not? And that remains the issue, because in the United Kingdom, what will happen if this violence continues will be an alienation of, it's already occurring in some areas, of the Muslim community. That cannot be good or healthy for our nation. It can't be healthy for integration either. So there has to be a new understanding, a reformation inside Islam that looks for coexistence, that looks for non-violent ways of people respecting and living alongside one another. We hold in our collections some Islamic artifacts, and Jewish artifacts as well, and artifacts of other religions and faiths. And I hope that maybe one of the galleries that is created in the Heritage Centre, and I know Jan and I are enthusiastic about this, will promote the idea of religious toleration, as well as recording the story of what happens when you don't have religious toleration, which is why this story is relevant to Muslims. I gave to a young man called Ed Hussein, who was a member of Al-Qaeda, a copy of a book called God's Secret Agents by Alice Hodge. It's a book that tells the story of the Jesuits and the Martyrs and what occurred to Catholics in England. I gave it to him because he'd left Al-Qaeda. He has rediscovered the importance of tolerance, of living alongside his neighbours. His book, The Islamist, records that story in great detail, and I really would recommend it to you. We have to find a way of sharing the earth with one another. This is, I think, the major challenge of our time, and so it's a good note perhaps to end on, but it's also one for us to go away and reflect and ponder and pray about as well.
And I would just add to that the Christian, among the things that Christians have brought to this world is a very robust concept of religious freedom. Ed Hussein has been here many times. He's one of our friends. So join me in thanking our guests today.